Hello everyone, this is Lecture 11, Conquest, Colonization, and Immigrant Identity. I've designed this particular lecture to go along with the George Sanchez reading on race and nation. And I think there he really focuses on helping us understand the importance of doing comparative immigration studies, but also about understanding the linkage between immigrants' experiences in their home country and how it impacts their lives here. So here I'm providing you a foundation of what I think are some of the key, number one, some of the key concepts, but secondly, I want to give both macro and micro background on some of the big themes related to this. All of this will feed into how we think about the experiences in agriculture, but these concepts will also kind of bleed over into the second half of the semester post midterm. So, what is conquest? Conquest refers to the subjugation and assumption of control of a place or people by use of military force. It's domination, coercion, and control of a group of people and place through legal, social, political, and physical violence. There are numerous different examples of this that are given in terms of understanding both global history and American history. Here in the United States, we could think about the experiences of Native Americans and the conquest of native lands here as an example of conquest. When you look abroad, you can think about the Philippines or Vietnam as examples of this. And staying on the topic of the Philippines, first you saw Spanish colonial rule controlling the Philippine Islands, and later on it becoming a military colony of the United States. And it wasn't until recent memory that we saw the independence of the Philippines. And so, with that, that's another way in which we see conquest happening. Here, I think it's important to note that it's not just about a military occupation, but it's also about what happens in terms of the form of laws, legal, in terms of the change of legal systems. We can look at in terms of the social implications of this kind of domination and coercion, political as well as physical violence. So we can think of an example here in terms of Native Americans in the United States. Um, we can look at the treaties and the ways in which the bartering system was heavily favored in the European form. They did not look at the cultural norms of Native Americans when they came here and traded. We began to see physical violence through wars and the physical removal of Native Americans from their lands, and we began to see the ways in which they were disempowered in law. And these are all chronicled by numerous different scholars who study Native American history. Now, imperialism refers to domination by one or more countries over others for political and economic objectives. Here, I want to focus on the idea that this is for political and economic objectives. That you want to get material resources. That you want to promote capitalism in some ways. Imperialism can be affected by force of arms or through the economic and political power exercised by state and corporate agencies. So, again, this isn't just about necessarily military coercion, but it can be through economic embargoes. So, for example, we can look at the different boycotts that have been held, or the ways in which there have been restrictions on development as examples of imperialism. Imperialism is sometimes organized in a formal empire with a ruling nation and colonized territories. Here we can look at England and the way in which the United States used to be a colony of England, as was Canada and Australia and numerous other countries. You can also exist where one nation or region exercises dominant influence over international trade and investment, patterns of economic development, and mass communication. Here, this means that you control um, the way in which a country operates. Here, we can look at post World War II, and one of the ways in which imperialism played out um, was the control of different countries, like, for example, Japan, by the U.S. forces. That's actually probably not the best example we can give, but we can also look at the ways in which trade has been controlled by the United States in other forms. So, colonialism. This is political domination of one nation over another, institutionalized in direct political administration by the colonial power. Here, I want you to focus in on the word institutionalized in direct political administration. They control all economic relationships, systematic attempt to transform the culture of the subject nation, involves extensive immigration from colonial power into the colony, and the immigrants taking on roles as landowners, business people, and professionals. And it's important to note that colonialism is a form of imperialism. This is often a question that's asked: what's the difference? Colonialism is a form of imperialism. Um, Again, we go back here and you look at this description, and it should echo what you already know about U.S. history, about the United States being a colony of England, for example. So what's the rationalization for colonialism? Well, historically, we can look at a lot of different writings here, and I'm going to use a quote by Ian Smith. He says, "I would say colonialism was a wonderful thing. It spread civilization to Africa. Before it, they had no written language, no wheel as we know it, no schools, no hospitals, not even normal clothing." Um, for individuals like Ian Smith, he promotes a theory they would call kind of more modernization theory. Um, they provide the rationale for colonizing is for the good of these nations. That what you're doing is in fact promoting their overall well-being by inserting sort of technological advancements. Here, what you begin to see is the popular rationale is that you are domesticating the savages, quote unquote. Um, and so here, the assumption is that modernity or modern forms of technology are better, that one culture takes dominance over another. Um, you can also look at theorists like Foucault, who look at colonialism and according to Foucault, he talks about it as a process of linking groups together, extending their hold, honing their efficiency, and increasing their power. Here, I think what we want to take away from Foucault's characterization is that it is a way in which that power is increased by access to resources. These resources can be in the form of people, in the um, it could also be resources in terms of education, raw goods and materials. There are numerous different types of ways in which one builds power. It's also about the accumulation of wealth via land and ownership. So, what are the consequences of conquest, colonization, and imperialism on subordinated groups of people? Well, we've discussed some of that already. We can look at the contemporary globalization and understand that the history of conquest, colonization, and imperialism has had a direct impact on migration flows. We understand, for example, with the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, that it decimated the Mexican economy, in particularly rural areas. And so what we know is that when people do not have jobs, they have to go look for ways to sustain their family. And as such, we've seen in Mexico um, the outflow of farmers to the cities in Mexico, and when there were no jobs there, to the United States as a way of supporting their families. Part of what I want you to think about, right, is that all of the readings that you've been assigned in this class ask you to think about the human toll that it takes on the individuals. Um, Post midterm, I want you to focus on the idea of family because that's going to be a centerpiece here. When you think about the conquest, colonization, imperialism, this directly speaks to, for example, the experiences of Philip Veracruz, why he left the Philippines, what he was looking for, it structured his opportunities, um, and it also impacted the people he worked with. So I want you to think about this in numerous different ways. What we do understand in terms of the research that's been done on impact of conquest and colonization, it has an impact on self-image and identity. If this were an immigration class, I would make you read some of the work of Yan Espiritu, whose book Homebound focuses on Filipino nurses and military men as well as their children, and that we understand that intervention by other countries, and in particular in Homeland, Espiritu looks at the U.S. military in the Philippines, impacts how they understand race in terms of whiteness, how they understand gender roles, how they think about their work. For example, in her book, she cites that for many Filipino men working for the Navy, they felt that they'd been feminized by the work they were doing because they were working in the kitchens, and there was a way in which they were emasculated as a consequence of that. So this feeds into different ways in which people view themselves. It impacts decision-making structures and leadership. We understand that in different societies you might have had matriarchal rule, you may have had collective rule, and instead what we see is that particularly under conquest and colonization, it is the rule of the mighty. The idea of consensus building or collectivity um, has gone to the side. It is the idea of majority rules, and even beyond that, it is about who can control the power. We can look at this week in the news and the shutdown of the U.S. government as an example of that. That power plays out in different ways, and that despite the fact that you are looking at a set of issues where a Congress passed a law, it was signed into law by the president, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court. You have a small group of people who are trying to change the decision-making structure, right? Um, in terms of impact of conquest and colonization, taking responsibility and creating a sense of entitlement. Um, we see these tensions oftentimes in terms of race relations and intergroup relations here. Who is responsible for the social conditions that groups face, um, and how do we respond to that? Who feels entitled to power, and who always feels disempowered? These are questions I want you to think about as you're reading through some of the work for the rest of the semester. It also creates a sense of community and community mortality. You can see this come about particularly in Vera Cruz's writings that you read um, last week, and it's the idea on the one hand, when you face very similar circumstances, both in terms of economic well-being or a lack of economic well-being, job competition, subjugation, um, experiences with military. You basically, when you share these experiences, it creates a sense of community. But also, you wonder how long will your community last? When you think about the Filipinos as it relates to United Farm Workers, there was a sense of mortality. Would the Filipino community still be there? Or would they just be usurped by another minority? How does it feel to be a minority within a minority? And of course, we understand most directly that it impacts a nation's wealth and resources. So T.F. Hodge, when he writes "From Within I Rise: Spiritual Triumph Over Death and Conscious Encounters with the Divine Presence," he said, in terms of the impact of colonization, when individuals and communities do not govern self, they risk being ruled by external forces that care less about the well-being of the village. So here, T.F. Hodge really talks about the sort of the larger macro level psychological impact of being ruled by another, and that it's sort of the idea that many people have that you've probably heard before, that when you own something, that you value it more versus when you're borrowing something, when it's not yours, or if you're renting something. The idea here is that communities lose a sense of well-being because they don't have ownership of their communities any longer. Um, at the macro and meso level, right? Franz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth writes, "Perhaps we haven't sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. The work of devaluing pre-colonial history takes on a dialectical significance today." Here, part of what we want to think about is the idea that winners write history. Fanon basically talks about the fact that the violence isn't just about what happens in the moment, but the way in which communities are vilified, how um, how the victims are blamed. Here we see this, and these are some of the things I want you to think about as you're reading. That so often workers are to blame, are often blamed for the conditions in which they work. Right? Workers are blamed for supposed job shortages. Workers are blamed um, if industries fail, as opposed to the business owners. So here, the additional violence that goes into colonialization, right, is the fact that it distorts, disfigures, and destroys those groups of people, which is why I highlighted that particular frame. At the meso level, there are numerous ways this plays out. And I'm not going to play too much into the psychology of this, but I felt that it was important to think about because you see the sort of ethno-stress or the psychological impact on workers. And you could see that in the writings of both Dolores Huerta, you saw it in the writings of Philip Veracruz, and it's also in many ways what Dr. Sanchez is getting to in his work. Um, so colonial subjects suffer from what Agnes Smith calls ethno-stress. In other words, she says, you will wake up in the morning and someone will be trying to steal your land, your legal rights, and your sister will be in jail. Your public Anglo-dominated school district will be calling about your children's conflicts with teachers or their spotty attendance, and our nonprofit organization's funding is getting cut by foundation because you are no longer a priority. Part of what we get into what Agnes Smith is getting at here is the stress comes from all spaces. That on the one hand, one is expected to quote unquote pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That the United States and our communities are a meritocracy, but at the same time, you're being bombarded with numerous fronts with things that make it hard to get out of any situation. And as we said, taking land, your legal rights, you have people in jail, and you're in a school district where the children are not necessarily being educated in a way that can sufficiently help them move up the educational ladder. So ethno-stress is the reality of our situation as Native women. What, so this is clearly the writer saying this, right? Which is directly related to the process of colonization, sexual violence, dehumanization, and marginalization of who we are. The reality is that what is personal and intimate, whether your family history, the perceptions of you as an individual, or perceptions of your daughters, becomes a centerpiece of power relations between people and societies. Part of what we begin to see here, and what she's really getting to in this writing, is that what we begin to see happening is the stereotyping of groups of people. And these stereotypes are based on people trying to exert a particular position of power. And as such, these particular stereotypes frame how we think about individuals as workers, as human beings, as students. They frame how people are viewed, whether it is factually true or not. This is another form of violence against the person. This is another way in which colonization and imperialism continues to dehumanize people even at an individual level. We see this play out when we think about immigrant workers in the fields. When you think about the ways in which that Latinos are always assumed as to be quote unquote undocumented, or when we characterize African Americans as being gangsters, right? These stereotypes are media perpetrations of individuals that take no account of the historic situation that framed their existence here in the United States or abroad. And this is a way in which colonization continues to dehumanize individuals. Winona LaDuke writes that the reality is that there is no way to build a real movement for justice and peace, whether between people or between peoples in the land, without challenging the violence of historical and contemporary colonialism. Part of what numerous authors write about here, Winona LaDuke being one, Michelle Jacob being another, is that you need to look at historical trauma in order to move forward. You need to rebuild that in order to address ethno-stress and historic trauma, you need to um, address these historic traumas by revitalizing culture, by rebuilding communities, by focusing on the strengths of a community or the assets of a community as opposed to what has always torn them apart. I think that this is a really unique intervention into discussions that I think it points to a unique way in which unions need to become much more contemporary in terms of how do they start incorporating things that we've lost, for example, culture within, amongst and across workers. So post-colonialism refers to kind of a set of theories, right? Or a set of theoretical approaches which focus on the direct effects and aftermaths of colonization. It represents an attempt to examine human exploitation, the normalization of this exploitation, repression, and dependency. Post-colonialism forms a composite but powerful intellectual and critical movement which renews the perception that and understanding of modern history, cultural studies, literary criticism, and political economy. Part of what we want to ask here, and this is really the whole point of this entire lecture, is what is the impact of colonialism? What are the impact of the historic relations between nations that are often violent? What happens to groups of people in the aftermath of this violence? Now, I know that it's unconventional at the very least to talk about colonialism as it relates to work. But I feel that these are important theoretical frames for you to understand because how, particularly for immigrant workers who you're going to be studying quite a bit of in the upcoming weeks, when you migrate to the United States, your history comes with you. And too often, when we talk about work, when we talk about workers, particularly immigrant workers, we act as if their history started the day they set foot on U.S. soil. When in reality, who they are, how they think about the world, their education, even their historic circumstances in terms of economics, poverty, etc., right? These are all framed by much more global macro issues. This isn't just about an individual's choice, but also how does the social structure or the multiple social structures frame who they are as workers. So I want you to think about these bigger things. It's important to consider these larger issues because talking about the experience of workers isn't about one person's story. It is about the themes that you see across different workers. Now, in the Sanchez reading for this week, I know he talks a lot about, hiring of, in the field of immigration history, and that's really not the important piece here. I really want you to think about how does the history of colonialism and imperialism inform power relations? Because underneath a lot of Sanchez's writing is about how do we start identifying power relations. And part of his argument in his writing is that you need to look across the different histories of different immigrant groups and look for the similarities and differences in order to identify power. And he argues, and I think the other question you should be able to ask is how does understanding the immigration experience of Asians and Latinos help us understand power? And more importantly, you should also be able to answer why is it important to compare and contrast the experiences of different groups. So keep this in mind. These types of themes and types of questions will be asked in your midterm, which I will have posted by Friday at 5. So if you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me.